Man, I'm really starting to feel my age now. Back when I was still a wee lad, I had myself the original PlayStation. It wasn't my first console or anything, but it was the one that really introduced me to more than just platformers. Well, mostly. I had played a few RPGs and such, but this was really where my love of the genre started to blossom. I didn't have any games for it at first, so I had to rent them. My memory is a little foggy, but I think the first games I rented were Mega Man X4 and The Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver. I wound up playing a lot of Mega Man X4 as well. I found Soul Reaver to be amazing. I was, like many children, a complete and utter moron when it came to anything that required basic thought, and the game gave me a headache as I couldn't figure out what I needed to do. Now, this had been during a break from school, and because of where I lived, none of my friends were nearby, and only one of them had a PlayStation at the time anyway. But when school picked back up, said friend gave me my first PS1 games. One was MechWarrior 2, and I'm still not entirely sure what happened to my copy of that. It just kinda up and disappeared. The other game was actually only half a game. Somehow they had found themselves with only one disc to what had quickly become a legendary title for the system. That disc was The Clear Side of Resident Evil 2. Sadly, that copy I had been given met an unfortunate end, having been crushed in an accident, though I did eventually replace it. Multiple times over the years because I have had way too many copies of that game. And of course, I sucked at it! I'd never before played a game where the idea was to save ammo and avoid conflict when possible, and I couldn't comprehend how I was supposed to win when surrounded by zombies who just wouldn't die. I'd quickly run out of ammunition and be left with only a knife, and then I'd usually die soon after. After probably a dozen deaths, I managed to make it to the police station with very little health left, but I had gotten to see a new cutscene from a wounded policeman talking about how Claire's brother had disappeared after an incident similar to the outbreak had happened at a mansion, but nobody had believed him. The officer gave me a key card that opened up a few doors, and I soon took my path through a door on the side where I was met with one of those, at the time, fancy-ass pre-rendered full-motion videos that blew my underdeveloped mind. A freakish monster dropped from the ceiling and proceeded to pretty much instantly finish off what little health I had left. And thus was my first experience with the survival horror genre and Capcom's Resident Evil franchise. Now these days, I'm nowhere near as much of a scrub at the series. Usually. Kinda. Okay, so I puss out on these games sometimes, but that's due to a lack of confidence in myself, and you guys can certainly see that I'm not a complete failure at that same game, seeing as how I played through it on this channel not that long ago. And, of course, you saw me puss out at the remake of the first Resident Evil a longer while back, again lacking confidence in myself, but that's beside the point I want to make here. My point is, Remake is widely considered to be a perfect example of, well, how to remake a classic game. It took everything that the original had and made it better. The graphics went from bright and cartoonish to dark and dreary. The hilarious voice acting was replaced with mostly competent acting. The dangerous zombies were now able to rise back up after being killed in a horrific new mutation that scared the pants off everyone, and new mechanics, areas, and bosses were added. But most of all, the core game was left pretty much completely intact, and was expanded upon. And really, it's no surprise why it's held up on a pedestal of quality. Remake is a damn fine addition to anyone's game library, and easily tops basically every other game remake ever made. And back in 2002, all we could think about was, oh holy crap, this was incredible! When is Capcom going to remake Resident Evil 2? And Capcom did indeed remake Resident Evil 2. 17 years later, at E3 2018, Remake 2 was finally unveiled, and pretty much stole the show for everyone, including myself. While there was tons of great games shown, the Resident Evil 2 trailer left me completely in awe. The beloved classic of my childhood was resurrected, and it looked crazy good. But it was also not an expanded remake like the first game was. Instead of having those classic fixed camera angles, Remake 2 used an over-the-shoulder camera similar to the more action-based post-Resident Evil 4 titles, which caused a lot of worries. And it was clear they were going to be changing stuff up. Well, the game came out about a month ago, and, well, I meant to review it sooner, but I got sick and was having trouble sleeping, so I decided I'd wait to do the review until I had recovered. and by then the Ghost Survivors free update was about to drop, so I'm adding that to this review as well. So after my glowing praise of the 30-minute one-shot demo, that's gonna need a valve handle. Oh, holy shit! Why were you in there? Oh, maybe you're already dead. Is Resident Evil 2's remake truly worthy of its namesake? Is it the perfect remake in the same way the first game's remake was? Let's find out if this game lives up to the massive hype it has generated. Now, just a heads up, I am going to try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but this is also a remake of a 20-year-old game. While there are some really cool new aspects, it still mostly follows the original game's plot, and I am going to reference some of the changes. Okay, so right out of the gate, let's just take a look at how this game is visually. Holy shit! Capcom proved they weren't playing around with the RE engine back when Resident Evil 7 came out, and surprisingly, RE engine is not short for Resident Evil, but actually Reach for the Moon. And hoo boy, they really are! While we've only seen 3 games using the engine thus far, all 3 look insanely beautiful. Remake 2 is drop-dead gorgeous, and filled to the brim with realistic graphics detailed with amazing effects and absolutely dripping with atmosphere. There's limited lighting in most areas, meaning you have to use your pitiful little flashlight to look around, and it really does add to the unsettling atmosphere. All the expected little touches are there too. Various articles and such are readable off the walls, and things that you might not expect to return are right where they belong. Even the locker I made fun of back in the original is present, albeit in a slightly different spot. The character models are superbly detailed too, and I was impressed they even have unique facial animations when in caution and danger status, with them making pain expressions. Although that can lead to some unintentional hilarity during conversations with other characters outside of the cutscenes. Admittedly, while the character models are great, Claire has the occasional weird expression, and it seems to be something that only happens with her face for some reason. It's nowhere near as terrible as some people try to make it out to be, but you will occasionally see an expression and just wonder if she realized she left the stove on or something. Another neat aspect is the damaged textures and persistent gore. When you shoot a zombie, you can see where the bullets impact and the blood splatters all over their clothing, and it can even tie into gameplay as you can shoot off zombie limbs. Seeing their arms, feet, legs, and even guts fall off their body is amazing to witness. Make no mistake, this is not a game for the squeamish. It's not just the shuffling masses either, the player characters start to look worn out over time too. While there is some scripted dirt and filth that covers them over the course of the story, they too gain wear and tear from battle. Zombies will get their bloody fingerprints on the characters during grabs even if you break out of their grasp. Bites will leave bloody splotches on the player's neck, and enemies that use melee attacks can leave tears in the player's clothing. Even better, it's not just the default outfits. Whether in-game bonuses or purchasable DLC, the costumes seem to all do this, except maybe the 1998 models that were added as free DLC, but I haven't used those enough to say. Not only does this really add to the survival feeling of the game, but it can also lead to some unintentional hilarity. I swear, this image just makes me think Sherry is looking at the cut on Claire's ass, but can't quite figure out how to tell her that her butt is sticking out. Also, I appreciate the classic outfit set not only changes Leon and Claire, but even Sherry gets a new costume based off her original. Claire even gives her the original vest instead of the new jacket. If there's one gripe I have with the visuals, it's the redesign of the Ivy enemies. While I get they were looking for a more realistic aesthetic, the new version just isn't as memorable. Now, don't get me wrong, graphically they look great and they move in a creepy swagger, but they're basically just green zombies with plant vines. Next up is the audio, and this is definitely the type of game you want to play with headphones if you can. The sound is fantastic, and it can even help you keep alive, especially in regards to one specific enemy's stomp, stomp, stomp. I think my favorite sound is that satisfying splat you get when you critical hit a zombie's head. Is it weird to say the audio is juicy? I will say footsteps are sometimes too loud or seem misplaced. I'm also a bit bummed the zombies do less groaning than the old games. They have more of the modern hissing sound much of the time, though not quite as bad as some zombie movies, shows, games, etc. The voice acting is mostly good. There is the occasional awkward line reading or deadpan delivery, but in the most important scenes they do just fine. Leon's probably the worst offender, but late game in particular, he has some solid delivery, especially right before the escape from the nest facility. Anyone who's played the game knows the scene I'm talking about. Now, a big detriment people pointed out with the demo was the music, which, while by no means terrible, was just heavily underutilized. And sadly, it remained so in the final game. The new soundtrack is fantastic, but you hear it so little. It does work in regards to leaving things to the in-game audio, but sometimes you just want some moody tracks to go with your survival attempts. Now, the classic soundtrack DLC does mitigate this, and honestly, it's impressive how well the music ripped from the PS1 original blends with the modern visuals, but it's also paid DLC, which can understandably turn some people off. It probably should have been unlockable in the game, really, but at least it's inexpensive. Still, I understand the agitation. But you guys probably want to hear about the gameplay and whatnot, since that's the most important part. Well, rest assured, this game is most definitely Resident Evil 2. But here's the thing, it's not the same Resident Evil 2 to be sure. Now, maybe I'm just not articulate enough to explain, but I'll give my best attempt to do so. In terms of being a pure survival horror game, where the enemies are tough and sometimes it's better to avoid or move past them, and your supplies are limited, for the most part, it definitely plays the role fantastically. You've got your basic RE puzzles, which might require a bit of detective work to solve, stuff found early on that comes into play later, optional rooms, etc. Now, none of these are going to make you tear your hair out in confusion, but let's be honest, most of the puzzles in the original weren't that hard to figure out either. There's even a few really well-designed ones, and some of them even change in the B scenarios. Speaking of enemies, a lot of people have complained about the bullet sponge zombies. Honestly, I love them. I love how dangerous they are, how sometimes they just won't drop, and even when they do, they don't always stay down. And you know what? Zombies could be a pain in the ass in the original, too. Just now your ammo's more limited. Lickers also got a hell of an upgrade. In the original, they were just the first tough enemies, but most of the time they weren't that dangerous. You could typically outrun them and they weren't difficult to fight, and often you could just as easily walk past them. Now, while they're susceptible to the knife or Claire's flame rounds, it's not uncommon to find them in a corridor with other enemies, meaning stealth isn't always a viable option, especially after a certain monster shows up to ruin your day. They also do a crap ton of damage and are a lot faster. The G adult type monsters have been changed from one of the easiest bosses in the original to a dangerous, surprisingly fast normal enemy in the sewers. Frankly, while I'm disappointed the giant spiders are gone, these guys are honestly a lot more dangerous than the spiders ever were. Ivies have been changed and no longer spit acid, and they don't slap you when they've been knocked down without being burned, but you also need to burn them alive or they keep getting back up. They've also been given an instant kill attack from what I've heard. Thankfully, I've never had the displeasure of dying to it since I always had a self-defense item on hand, but still, instant kills suck. You also can't seem to damage them normally. They have these weird orange puss bag weak points that you can shoot to temporarily debilitate them, or you can just burn them until they're cooked, at which point they actually will leave you alone for good. Speaking of which, the flamethrower doesn't suck this time around! I also appreciate that they brought back the self-defense items from the first remake, but changed them into sub-weapons. Grenades were actually a concept in the original version of RE2, but were cut for whatever reason from the final game, so it's nice to see them in the remake alongside flash grenades. The knife is also significantly different this time around. It breaks, though you can unlock an unbreakable variant, but it can be used to escape when an enemy grabs onto you, much like the self-defense daggers in the remake of the first game, and you can regain it by incapacitating the enemy you stabbed it into. They also brought back Resident Evil 3's gunpowder mechanic, sans the reloading tool. Admittedly, there is a lot of gunpowder to be found, but I found myself typically hoarding it for high-end ammunition whenever I could. Getting to the end of the game with like 60 Magnum bullets made me feel pretty cocky. Beyond that, it's pretty much the classic Resident Evil style. Run around looking for keys, downing enemies while trying to conserve ammo, solving puzzles, and trying not to die. That is, until you start getting stalked by Mr. X, who then begins regularly hunting for you as you explore the remainder of the station. This guy? He's unkillable, and he can be tough to even stop temporarily. He'll eventually get back up, and honestly, shooting at him just seems to piss him off more. And even if you do momentarily stop him, he doesn't drop items like he did in the original. Now a lot of people find this frustrating. Me? I think he's awesome! He adds so much tension to the game. Although, admittedly, he's the reason why I wussed out and started over on baby mode. That is to say, the assisted difficulty. Yeah, I punked out. I walked into this game thinking, well, I'm a veteran of Resident Evil, especially Resident Evil 2. I can totally handle this remake. Shut up, I lack confidence playing those on this channel. Don't pick on me. So, on my first run of Remake 2, Mr. X proceeded to smack me around, and running from him led me to getting my shit wrecked by Lickers. So yes, X gave it to me. After this happened a few times, I realized I just was not ready for standard mode. And that's not a complaint. Even if I found the difficulty higher than anticipated, that's not a bad thing at all. Let's be honest, the original Resident Evil 2 is probably the easiest game in the franchise. It feels like this game was created with the mindset of, they want survival horror? Let's make them have to actually survive. Even on assisted, I wound up actually wondering if I'd have enough ammo or healing items. However, I do feel like it maybe eased up on the difficulty too much at the same time. I don't know, something in between I think could have fixed this. But what I'm trying to say is, standard, and especially hardcore mode, amped up the difficulty from the originals, and for fans of the genre, or really anyone looking for a challenge, did so without trying to appeal to wider audiences. I feel that this game was actually made for fans of the classic survival horror titles, and I think it delivered. They also revamped the bosses, who are now significantly more interesting to fight, at least for the most part. In the original, most of them were just run away and shoot them from a distance, with only the final boss of the A scenario and the second to last boss of the B scenario really changing from that. The bosses tend to be more aggressive now, with stuff like new grabs, sneak attacks, environmental damage, and a slew of new things that make most of them more dangerous than they were originally. Not all of them, mind you, but I'd say most of them are considerably more interesting to fight. Probably the last noteworthy change is that Leon and Claire now have unique scenarios. Certain aspects of the game are now exclusive to them individually, as well as their secondary characters having unique parts where you take control of them. It doesn't change a ton, mostly just the second half of the police station and how they wind up in the sewers, but it's still a nice change instead of just having slightly different sewer entrances like the original. Well, gee, Kurakan, you say, that sounds pretty swell. Surely this remake does everything better than the original. Well, not quite. Make no mistake, it does a lot of things right, and in many ways is superior to the original. You see, the B scenario kinda sucks now. Okay, that's a bit harsh to say, but it feels entirely tacked on. While the remix puzzles are nice, it mostly just changes the beginning and the end of the game, and the vast majority remains the same. The stories play out almost identically to the A scenario. Remember how Leon A, Claire B provided a significantly different set of events to Claire A, Leon B? Yeah, well, now the only major change is how you wind up at the police station and that you fight the true final boss. Only Claire fights G4, no matter what. Only Leon fights the Sewer Gator and Super Tyrant, no matter what. Sherry always gets infected with the G-Virus, no matter what. And Ada always falls instead of getting smacked around by Mr. X, no matter what. I think the only significant new thing in the B scenario is you occasionally come across notes from the other character. Well, that, and you get a .45 caliber handgun at the start of the game, in which you will never find any 9mm ammo in the second scenario. And that unfortunately brings me to another gripe. The story really suffers. Because the same events happen in the same order in the B scenario, it causes continuity errors. Areas that should be destroyed are intact when you arrive. Bosses the other character already fought reappear unaltered. Annette Birkin dies twice. It's a shame because the redone scenes are fantastic. They have great direction, and the actual writing of the dialogue and sequences is vastly improved over the original, but there's simply less of it. And not just in terms of the B scenario. Leon and Claire meet up briefly after an early part of the A game and at the beginning of the B scenario, much like the original, albeit now under different circumstances. But they will never see each other again until the very end of the game. Now you can point out that was the case in the original game, but they did keep in contact by radio and generally explained what they were up to in the meantime. While the notes you come across are a nice touch, it's a shame the radio is only ever utilized once or twice, and only during an early part of the A scenario, despite Marvin even telling them how important it is. Now despite this, the cutscenes and dialogue are really improved, at least for the most part. For instance, the exchanges with Claire and Sherry are much more emotive. It's not just them blurting out each other's names 40 times anymore. Claire's much more severe in her actions when Sherry's involved, going so far as to bitch out a Ned over her neglect. And while I was a bit concerned about it from the trailers, her threatening Irons over Sherry's safety honestly was a lot less edgy than I thought it'd be. Even the notes you come across are more disturbing, especially the stuff you find involving Irons. I was genuinely weirded out. Leon also comes off as a bit less of a dumbass, going so far as to argue, question, and even criticize Ada's actions instead of just going, "Ada, wait! Let me protect you!" I also like Ada's change of cover from looking for her boyfriend to pretending to be an FBI agent, though I wish they had some mention of that given the reference to the first Resident Evil and the original RE2. And that's another thing I have to put as a strike against this remake. There's barely any references to the mansion incident. There's a few small things that point to it happening, but even Marvin, who recapped the events between RE1 and RE2, when asked about what's going on, basically replies, "Oh, I don't know." Ben also seems to only be in the remake because he was in the original, as you see him only in a single, basically meaningless cutscene. On the other hand, Kendo was actually given a bit more personality, though he is in the game about as long as he was before. His new sequence now happens much later in the game, but I'd be lying if I said I felt nothing from it. Again, giving credit to the writing and dialogue. It's just a shame the story as a whole isn't quite on par or better than the original. So, what about post-game content? Well, luckily they didn't falter here. Not entirely, anyway. Well, sadly, there's no randomizer like the Nintendo 64 version, and it's strangely lacking the Extreme Battle minigame from the DualShock re-release, and basically every re-release outside of the 64 version. The original extras are still there. Unlockable super weapons with infinite ammo, alternate costumes, and both Hunk and Tofu are right where they belong. There was also an update on February 15th that added in 4 new what-if scenarios, except they're not really new scenarios. It's basically a story blurb with a simple cutscene at the start and a brief cutscene at the end, and some heavy-duty segments with tons of enemies. They're similar to the 4th Survivor minigame with Hunk in that regard, with much of it basically just being an intense try-not-to-die challenge mode. And unfortunately, that does give me mixed feelings. On one hand, this is great for the hardcore players who want something more, or for someone who just wants more action in general. On the other hand, that more intense survival horror stuff is dropped, although the item management is still intact. Admittedly, I noped out of these and just played on WUS mode again. My personal feelings on these Ghost Survivors chapters is they're less than I was hoping for, but more than I'd typically expect of a free update. I honestly wouldn't mind paying for a more fleshed out version of these, as they mostly reuse the same assets, so remixing a few puzzles and a handful of cutscenes could probably be done. But at the same time, this was a free update, so I can't bitch too much. And apparently, more are planned, which is good for those who enjoyed it. I like that even Ghost Survivors has its own unlockable accessories and such, and I think it's cool that some of the lesser characters got the spotlight, even if it's not optimal. As for the DLC that's been released thus far, is it worthwhile? I like the DLC guns. They're not overpowered and have unique properties, but still have disadvantages to the vanilla guns, since those can be upgraded. On the downside, they'll be less than worthless in the B scenarios, since you'll never find ammo for them, and thus have to rely on gunpowder for 9mm bullets. It doesn't help that you can earn an infinite ammo variation by getting an S rank on at least standard difficulty. The costumes are a bit hit and miss. I like a couple of Claire's, namely her Noir and Elza Walker costumes, the latter of which was just such a brilliant reference to the never-released RE2 prototype. There's also a couple free costumes, Leon and Claire's original 1998 models. These are super charming and I love them being there, but I'm a bit disappointed they don't have the injured and coatless variations, and further bummed that they also don't change Sherry and Ada to their 1998 versions, especially since even Sherry got a new look when Claire uses her classic costume. Would have been even more of a treat if it changed everything to the 98 variants, but that's probably just me being greedy, I think. The paid DLC guns and costumes really aren't necessities. They're nice, but I'd only recommend them if you're gonna geek out on them like I did. And of course, the last one is the original PlayStation 1 soundtrack, and I absolutely 100% recommend this. While I like the new soundtrack, it's just kinda in the background of the game and doesn't really stand out most of the time, which is a shame as it's well composed. But they went for a much more atmospheric approach, and while nice, hearing those classic tunes play where they're supposed to is not only a hell of a nostalgic trip, but it just sounds so damn good. I also love how it restores the menu bloops and adds the title call, though I am disappointed the title screen uses the original game's opening theme rather than something like the prologue theme, and the title call is the one from the GameCube port rather than the original one. But that's just me being nitpicky. I am hoping we get more costumes and maybe some new scenarios in the future, but the DLC we've gotten is pretty average in general and nothing to get too excited over, with the exception of that superb OST. I should also touch on the performance. And yeah, despite how I had initially seen the demo, later viewings, playthroughs, and the final game have shown me that frame rate definitely isn't the most stable. While it never really impacted my ability to play, I did notice some substantial drops on my PS4, and from what I've seen, the Xbox One version has really noticeable performance issues. Mind you, I'm talking about the base versions. The PS4 Pro and Xbox One X seem to play just fine with minimal drops. Now, admittedly, I could swear my performance improved a little after the Ghost Survivors update, but that's probably just my imagination. Either way, my personal experience with the standard PS4 was positive, but not perfect. If you're using an upgraded console, then you're in pretty stable hands. As for the PC version, I've heard nothing but praise for it and its optimization, so it sounds like if you want to go that route, there's plenty of options to keep it running smooth. So after all that, is this the ultimate remake to surpass the original? A remake that goes beyond what the first game's remake went through? A weapon to surpass Metal Gear? Nope. As a remake, it falls short in some ways, and it's simply nowhere near the level of complete improvement the original remake was. But, if you think that makes it a bad game, a bad Resident Evil, or even a bad remake, you're out of your damn mind! While in some ways it falls short of being a perfect remake, it absolutely is an amazing game. And though it's a very different take on Resident Evil 2, it's still very much Resident Evil 2. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad it's not a perfect upgrade from the original. Now, this isn't meant to be an excuse. I'm not trying to defend the questionable choices they have made. But think about it this way. After the first remake came out, is there any real reason to go back to the original PS1 version other than maybe to laugh at the voice acting? Remake completely overwrites the original and surpasses it in pretty much every possible way. That's not to say the original game is bad. It's not. It's a little janky to be sure, and it's almost impossible to take it seriously with its bright, colorful graphics and hysterical voice acting, but damn, it's a good classic. But since I got the remake, I've played through the original maybe a handful of times, but constantly find myself going back to the remake, more so since the HD remaster dropped. Now granted, I've barely played Resident Evil 2 since the remake came out, but I can't say I haven't had the urge to play it, especially since I just had it reinstalled on my desktop before the remake came out. I probably could have just shortened this to, the remake is great, but I'm glad I still have reasons to go back and play the original RE2. Now, would I have preferred the remake to have had everything and then some? Oh, hell yeah! I am disappointed by them removing some of the enemies instead of just using them more or making them more interesting. I would have liked them to expand on the story instead of truncating it, to be sure. But as a game, I think I actually like Remake 2 more than I like the remake of the original. Hell, Remake 2 may very well be my favorite entry into the series. But as a remake, yeah, the first remake was objectively better as a remake. It took everything that made the original so good and made it even better. This one does a lot of things right, and in many ways does surpass its original, but at the same time, the missing aspects and the wonky storytelling hurt it. So, do I recommend this remake? Oh yeah, I do! It's an amazing title that makes me grin, and it makes me scream like a little girl in terror all at the same time, and I absolutely love it. Despite its flaws, it's easily one of my favorite games in recent years, and that's saying a lot. Going through a familiar yet fresh experience with a game that was a major part of my childhood was wonderful. I absolutely say go out and get yourself a copy. Just don't sell your copy of the original to get it. But goodbye to the fans, Zombob.
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
Thank you guys so much for watching. Did you love this remake as much as I did? Sorry it took me so long to get my review out. If you want some more Resident Evil goodness, why not check out my playthrough of the original PS1 game? Or you can check out Shads and I being super incompetent at Resident Evil 5 and 6 if you want something from the later, more action-y games. Or perhaps you want another review, in which case you can watch me decide just how much I hate Operation Raccoon City.